Hello and welcome to this video. And I have in interview today, Mr. Tim BOWNESS. How are you, Tim?
I'm all right, thank you.
You're good, are you? You happy?
Oh, am I happy? Am I ever happy? I think that is the question.
I know a lot of people wonder this about you, because outwardly you don't seem that happy, but inwardly I've
Is it
always felt
true?
you're very happy.
See, I would have thought it was the opposite, that basically I viewed joy, especially through my music, but internally it is indeed a dark chasm.
A dark chasm, and that's what we're going to be exploring on this interview today. So, just so you know, Tim is one half of No Man. He's also had a successful solo career. He gets put in the genre of progressive rock quite a lot. And we're going to be discussing that as whether this stuff is prog or not. That could be an interesting conversation. He also does the Album Years podcast, which is very successful with Steve Wilson. And I have been reacting to that and poking a little bit of anarchic irreverence their way. But you've also, it must be mentioned that I also drum for you, don't I, Tim? So we do know each other, and so all the
True.
irreverent comments and criticisms, I've been very aware that Tim will have been seeing them, and we may be getting into some of that. But before we start, what's the real reason for this meeting at such a
Well, the
hurried?
real reason
The
for this
real,
meeting.
shall we tell him the real reason?
Well, no, the real reason is that we're going to actually discuss progressive rock,
That's
analyze
not the
it
real
as a
reason.
musician.
It's
I'm going to
remember
react.
I'm postmodern because so we have this facade that we go to talk about
Yeah.
something about prog, but really, what's the real reason for this?
Well, actually, I think it's all of it's a reason. We're also gonna, have my reaction to your reaction and your reaction to my
That well,
reaction.
that's quite
Oh, yeah.
postmodern. But what about the gig
Really
we've got
good.
that we want to sell?
But also, we're actually playing in London, September 13th. It's an album launch, Powder Dry, which is my new album on Kscope. And it's a fantastic band, including Andy on drums, Matt Stevens guitar, John Jowett on bass, and
Legend.
Rob Groker.
Not so much a legend, but you know what I'm saying. Yeah,
Keyboard.
this is an incredible thing. So me and Tim will be playing in London. So if anyone's around London, come and see us play. Where is it, and what's the date, and all the things, and how do they buy tickets?
Well, I think it's the Camden Club, isn't it? And
Yeah,
it's September 13th.
the link will be in the video
Yeah, you can buy
description.
from We Got Tickets or Burning Shed. I think those are the two main places. But I think the main reason for watching it really is that it has been a fantastic experience as a live band, really, because I love playing with this particular band because no one performance is the same. And this includes each song. The song lengths differ from gig to gig, the intensity differs. And there's a tremendously sort of live feeling with this band, I think.
And I have enjoyed it very much. Originally, I was asked by Tim to drum for him on one show because he needed a band. I think he approached John Jowett, who had played with you previously, and I've always been John's right hand man. So he pulled me in, and then we pulled in Rob, and we got Matt in. And when we got in the room, there was a chemistry there, and that's quite rare, isn't it, that you actually get a chemistry with musicians. You can get very competent musicians, and they can play
Yeah.
together. But we had a chemistry, and we're still going, and it's not been something planned that much, is it? We keep playing because it's fun, and I'm really looking forward to this gig in London because it's nice to do a gig in London. So please come down and say hello. I think that's it, and we have now got out of the way the selling of the real purpose, because there's always a real reason, isn't there? So everyone's trying to sell something, but at least we're upfront about it, aren't we, Tim?
That's true. Or I could do my Harry Bartell selling you Powder Dry, the new album on Kscope as well. But anyway,
I will put
come on.
links to it all.
The real reason is to put to rights your reaction videos and our videos in the first place, isn't it? Isn't
Yes,
it?
I think so. I think so. I wanted to talk about because I was been watching your podcast with Mr. Steve Wilson, and you haven't covered "Are You Being Served" at all on there, and you were doing 1972 the other day. And
Yeah.
why haven't you? I mean, because obviously they pioneered the cash register loop as a theme tune, which of course Pink Floyd picked up on in the following year in 1973. And so why wasn't this
Yeah.
mentioned on your podcast?
Well, I think you were right to pick up on How Are You Being Served influenced Dark Side of the Moon. I think they were clearly watching it as they were making the album, and this cash register sound triggered something in Roger Waters' brain. So it
Roger
was very
Waters is a
significant.
massive fan of Are You Being Served, I've heard. You know who his
I
favourite
think it's
you know who his
wrong.
favourite one was?
Who's that?
John Inman.
John Inman.
Yes, what was his name in the show? Was it Mr. Humphreys? What was John
I
Inman's?
bel
Oh God,
I
that's
think it
ridiculous.
could have been Mr. Humphrey.
Captain Peacock, Mrs. Slocum,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
then
Mr.
behind
Humphrey.
that oh I can't remember any of that. I would have thought is that Mr. Rumpole in the middle? I would have thought I'd been able to remember these. Now, all the American viewers are wondering what we're talking about. And what we're really talking about here is the what I call the English aesthetic. It's a sort of slightly anarchic, quirky, humorous thing that us English have, where rather than talk about serious progressive rock, we'd rather talk about early 70s British sitcoms, wouldn't we? And link them in some sort of comic way to Pink Floyd. And I feel that on your podcast, you and
Mhm.
Steve do a very similar thing. There's a very low level sort of humour running through it, which I don't know whether everybody's getting. And you've been messaging me. It's not been so much my pushback because obviously I'm going to ask, offer a bit of criticism and my own opinion, but it was more the comments of my viewers, of which you are now talking to directly. So what was the what did you think about the comments?
What did I think about the comments? Most of them were absolutely fine. There were a couple of cruel comments, and the
Cruel.
cruel comments, I would say. Um, so generally, it's kind of more critical than the comments we get on our own site. But then obviously that's because a lot of people who listen on our own site are either fans of what we do already, or they've
Mm.
come to the podcast and they enjoy it. But I think some of it's a bit unfair. I think especially against Stephen, really, because I think Stephen has got a very good sense of humor, and Stephen doesn't take himself that seriously. Although it was interesting watching the show filtered through you, it kind of has echoes of those BBC Two late night review programs, which, to be quite honest, I loved. So that's not a bad thing in my book. But yeah, I was a bit surprised. I think the reaction to the ELP trilogy generally, I thought we were quite kind. I didn't think we trotted out most of the hideous cliches that apply to progressive rock. And in fact, I went out of my way to say that ELP totally go against many of the cliches that are attributed to progressive rock, and you wholeheartedly agree.
Mm.
And I think it's kind of interesting that one of the internet phenomenons at the moment is that somebody says you've said something. So, for example, I think it actually got around that we'd been a little bit dismissive of ELP and Trilogy, which we hadn't. We were actually, I'd say, we gave it a kind of an 8 out of 10 review. We're
Mm.
generally very positive and also very positive about most of the band's output. But that suddenly became what? They said that? They're talentless fuckers. How dare they? This then becomes the narrative. And we did it with Rush. That I think we talked about what was it? It was Power Windows. And we've been incredibly positive about Rush. And with Power Windows, I think we actually dared to say mildly that in this case, the technology possibly got the better of the band, that they were listening to too much
I think
ZTP.
this is what I find so funny is because you're both sort of English gentlemen. You're actually very polite and you are very kind, and I'm aware of this. I felt, but see what happened at my end was I wouldn't have done those reactions if I didn't have so many people messaging me going, "Have you seen what the album users have said about Genesis? They've said that Supper's Ready is not absolutely brilliant, and they've said it's not as good as Close to the Edge." And so I go wandering over, thinking, well, I'm going to have to. And if I'm going to watch it, I'm going to do a reaction. And I did that one, and then the ELP one. They were going, Andy, you shouldn't have done that. Go to the end of the video and see what they said about Trilogy. So I thought, well, it's my job now to come in and represent this the counter argument. But of course, I think the trouble with the LP and I felt that you are actually doing a very, very good job of actually bringing to the fore the very things that I then pointedly really pointed out, which
Mm.
is the fact that if you step back from a conceptual point of view, a lot of the things that us more erudite music fans, because that's what it is, isn't it? Really, because I'm the same. I
Mm.
went through a long period of really disliking ELP. When I started doing my channel, I really had a go at them, and then when I did my top 20 progressive rock bands, I forgot about them. And I didn't remember until I got to number two. So you can watch the video. I get to number two and go,
Mm.
hang on, there's no ELP. And I realized I'd blocked them out of my mind because I hated them. And I actually stepped back and thought, why do I hate them? It's the comedy stuff and the
Mm.
awful sort of Chaz and Dave rock and roll, Mrs. Mills piano playing rock and roll
Yeah.
pastiches. I don't like that. I just want the darkness. And I always felt the first albums got that in bucket loads. But then I started to analyze it and I started to realize that they're almost like a band of the people. They're less cultured than a lot of the other progressive rock bands. You know,
Mhm.
in a way, they get accused of being pretentious, but actually they're not.
They're not.
They're
Well, I think what I said in the video is that one of the things people forget is that ELP were an incredibly exciting rock and roll showman
yeah.
experience. And, you know, they had influences from ragtime, boogie, Jerry Lee Lewis, all in the mix because they loved it. I think they were, you're totally right. I think they were totally genuine. And they did have that. I think you described it as the Barnum and Bailey circus approach. Again, because I think they loved that. So all of that side of things, I think they were an incredibly exciting band who, at their best, made a phenomenal sound. I think when they played together as a collective trio, tremendous stuff. So I love, First Side of Tarkus,
Mm.
most of Brain Salad Surgery, the stuff I don't like. I mean, you're right. I'm not a great fan of Benny the Bouncer. I can't say I am. It doesn't do it for me.
See, for me
And
with brain salad surgery, it's Jerusalem I don't like. Because
okay,
Jerusalem is a very beautiful tune, and that Greg Lake singing it with that arrangement just seems to take anything away from that. It's like if they did
I,
Abide with Me, you could imagine them doing Abide with Me.
I quite like it.
you know?
I quite like that because it is so excessive, is so
Yeah,
pompous, and his voice is amazing. It's very much this kind of clear bellowing on the piece. I mean, there's such a sense of pride in that version of Jerusalem that I rather like it actually.
yes,
But the other thing I'm not sure, the other thing I don't like, because you were asking me about specific elements, really, saying, well, why don't you mention this? It's that they did have a tendency. Take one of my favorite tracks by them, Take a Pebble. It's got the most beautiful melody. And Lake had a great knack of knocking off these incredible acoustic beauties,
he did.
looking
Can you imagine the album of just those? If they were to
yeah,
bring out
well,
those, and it would, I mean, that would put Astral Weeks in its place. Let's not go there.
I'm not quite sure about that, but one of my theories is Greg Lake and Ian Anderson in particular, if they'd have been acoustic singer-songwriters, they'd have been huge. There's
Yeah.
no doubt if you'd have just had an album of Take a Pebble,
But
Lucky
you mean
Man,
huge critically because they were huge commercially, but both of those were huge
of
commercially.
course, of course.
Uh,
But I'm saying they'd have been
yeah,
huge in different territory altogether.
yeah,
Greg Lake could have been the Clifford T. Ward, but with more success, or
mm,
the new Cat Stevens. Ian Anderson was definitely a rival to Roy Harper at his best.
yeah, without a
Um,
doubt.
So they could have had, I think, different careers. And I think I've got this Academy of the Underrated for me that there are certain artists that if they'd have just gone on their first album, never succeeded. So like take Thin Lizzy's first two albums or ELP's first album. If these had been dead in the water, we'd still be talking about these as these lost gems from
Yeah.
another era because there's so much talent and individuality in those artists. But going back to the point, the other thing I never particularly liked about ELP compared with, say, Genesis, King Crimson,
Mm.
yes, is that they had, and it was maybe from the jazz tradition, these very long solo sections. So Take a Pebble would go off into various solo sections.
Mm.
Quite often, if they had a piece on Trilogy, there'd suddenly be almost this kind of Oscar Peterson jazz deviation, which I quite liked.
Mm.
but I wasn't quite sure what the purpose of it was. You know, for me, it was when the band were working as a whole and when they were working in service of the song. I suppose that was it, really. So it's
Mm.
not a great criticism because, as I said, I think that they were brilliant showmen. I think they had a rock and roll energy that people forget. And I think they had a totally stupid sense of humor that goes against this idea of, oh, progressive rockers never had a sense of humor.
No, I think they are one of the greatest of the progressive rock bands, and I think to try and measure them against Yes or say Van der Graaf Generator, the more serious ones, and that was an ascendancy of seriousness. They are not
Yeah.
that, and they do something else. One of the things I'd be interested in talking to you about is the context within if this is happening, because you did the album years as a podcast, so it was audio to start off with, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And you've had a ton of success with that. I've been a big fan of it, and the thing is, I respect the. I'm being serious now. I respect the podcasters and YouTubers that actually have a novel insight and they actually can go. And both you and Stephen have that in bucket loads, and I'm so impressed that you can jump around through such wild genres. I tend to know about what I talk about, but as soon as you get onto something else, you seem to have a great knowledge of all sorts of different styles of music, and I find it very inspiring. And I enjoy then questioning it and seeing where it leads. But the audience needs to understand that what you're doing is at a very high level, which is why it's a success, because you're not just trotting out the usual "I've read about it on Wikipedia" type of thing.
Mm.
You know, you're bringing an insight into it. And what the reason why I reacted in the way I did about Trilogy is I wanted to question that sort of very 90 post-punk 1980s sort of critical method, which is like you just said, that they're not playing for the song. You know, so that will be something that's trotted out, you know, or they don't play for the song. And I'm a little bit like, hang on, what does that actually mean? Because if the song involves a like great long keyboard solo in the middle,
Mm.
surely that's the song, isn't it? It's ELP.
I think sometimes it came across as padding to me or just a solo excursion. I guess
Yeah.
that was, you know, my personal feeling. And I might be wrong about that. You know, it's just
So
how
I think
I
that
read.
it's not. I mean, it's art. You can't be right or wrong. It's just pushing against that, because I think that there is in the West, especially say in the UK, we're in this sort of where things that are planned. It's like a sort of post-literate cultural view. Things that are planned, things that are worked out, things that have forethought, have more worth than people making it up on the spot. And so we value the structural stuff and the intention, but we don't value so much just musicians flapping around doing whatever they want for too long. And I wonder whether that is actually at the point in the 1960s when these bands were emerging, that sort of free expression was valued as a thing in itself. And so audiences they were very utopian. They were looking to the future, and it's like, well, you were sort of making it up at that point. And I wonder whether the problem is we don't value that so much. You know, the basically the freak out aspect of it, the experience of it. You know, because if you've gone to see Pink Floyd in 1966, what you would have been watching was probably endless no songs and improvisation,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but it expressed a certain viewpoint of society, and we're at the other end of it now. So a little bit too buttoned down in a way.
I think you're entirely right, but I think the thing is that when you listen to, let's say, psychedelia, early underground progressive, early fusion music, you know,
Mm,
like we both love the first Tony Williams Lifetime album. And I particularly love that because it's burning,
mm,
everybody burning in the music. And I think the same is true of what Miles Davis was doing at the time, the same is true of what, yes, Pink Floyd, within whatever abilities they have, because Pink Floyd were obviously musically more limited than Yes. But I love those psychedelic freakouts of Pink Floyd, Hawkwind even during a similar period. And I think they were defining the territory. At that stage, it wasn't ossified, it wasn't a
mm,
cliche. This was musicians playing to the limits of their ability, heading for the cosmos.
mm,
And I kind of love that. And I sort of feel that by the mid 70s, this had become expected or it had become an affectation. So I enjoy it less, I guess, after the sort of early to mid 70s because it's become a cliche at that stage. So it's not that I dislike it in
Mm,
itself. I think there is something that when the artists are defining the territory, and the point is, yes, didn't make Close to the Edge as a progressive rock band. They were drawing on anything from country, Beatles, jazz, classical music, their own passions to create this
mm,
suite of music. And I think they were carried away by enthusiasm, idealism, and actually they didn't know what they were making, but it
yeah.
became known as progressive rock. Ditto the Genesis, because I know that people were complaining about Stephen's reaction. He can't listen to that period Genesis because of the imitators. But I was lucky enough that I kind of discovered a lot of this stuff when I'd not read the music papers. I discovered it really sort
Yeah,
of
I could tell that,
midway
and I think I
through.
did mention that at the time. I think Tim being a
Yeah.
little bit older, you actually can remember the zeitgeist of prog, whereas I'm not. I think I'm the same age as Stephen. So we were all after. I'm pretty sure that I was like Stephen, and I think that's why I pushed against him. Now I'm not pushing against. I'm pushing against myself because I can remember being quite a well-read, nerdy, a little bit lonery. Um, Music obsessed sort of nerd in 1982. That's who I was. I'd go down the library and get a rock and roll encyclopedia and read up these bands and then go around secondhand shops trying to find these records that were all deleted and
Yeah.
had no one at school. I mean, I got into prog because somebody had happened to get the S album and they were so horrified by it in 1981 that they came and said, "You'll give that to Andy Edwards. He likes weird music," and that's how I discovered it. I swapped it for Hawkwind. I swapped my Silver Machine picture disc, and a picture
I
disc
got a
had
lot of things.
currency.
I did get a lot of things at school. I mean, I was just very open to music. My first musical love was John Barry and his film
Mm,
music, then Ennio Morricone. And I kind of hated pop music for a long time. And I think when I was about 11, 12, a friend bought his dad's cassette collection over as we were playing Sabutio, which is an
mm,
important game in
yeah.
English culture. And it was stuff like Pink Floyd, Wish You Were Here, Mike Oldfield's Ommadawn, Tangerine Dream, Phaedra, Vangelis. And I, at the time, had a collection that was full of John Barry film soundtracks and some Beatles. I love Beatles and McCartney. And of course, how did I get into Beatles and McCartney? Because McCartney did the soundtrack to the James Bond film Live and Let Die. So this was my gateway into pop music.
That's the finest moment of all the Beatles, including their actual albums and all the solo stuff. It's all brilliant, and I
Oh,
love the
brilliant.
Beatles, but the finest moment is the theme to Live and Let Die, which is full on progressive rock. It goes through all those different moods and swings, and
Yeah, yeah.
it's got a sound to it. Which how would you do that? Live and Let Die. It's just got a sound to it. Little bits of reggae, and then these big sort of almost like heavy metal orchestral bits, and oh, it's just such a brilliant piece of music. Paul
It is
McCartney's at his
fantastic.
peak.
And it's something that you'd never come up with. It's the sort
No,
of thing that I don't think AI couldn't come up with Live and Let Die. That is what it
could you
is so clever.
imagine that? Cubby Broccoli or whatever he's called.
It's called broccoli,
that
right?
sounded too close to the vegetable one the way I said it. Cubby Broccoli rings up
Yeah.
Paul McCartney. He says, "Can you give us a song?" And he goes, "Yeah. What's the film going to be called? Oh, we're thinking of doing Live and Let Die. Oh, okay, I'll work with that." And then you come up with that. He's not even got the title.
It is true that the lyric bears no relationship to the film or the book. It's
See,
not like
look,
Paul.
I've got when I'm doing this, people don't realise I always have that in front of
Oh,
me.
lovely.
I love the Beatles so much. I really do. I think they're such a genius band. I,
And they are they're an early progressive prototype in that they're a gateway to so many other musical
oh,
styles.
totally.
Wow.
It's incredible. Going
But
back to the sort of overblown solos of
oh, sorry, but I was
ELP.
going to tell my story. So anyway, so I'd listened to
Yeah,
that stuff without prejudice, and it's before I'd read the music papers. So obviously, I loved, John Barry, Beatles, McCartney, and then I think the Floyd in particular took me, and Led Zeppelin as well. I think Physical Graffiti was one of the albums, but it was things like Top of the Pops. So for me, I could go out and buy the Stylistics, 10cc, Stevie Wonder,
yeah.
and then Genesis were on Top of the Pops with, I believe it was Follow You, Follow
Follow you
Me.
for me. Yeah.
I loved it, got the album because it was cheap at the time, especially on the school notice boards, and then got Foxtrot. So that was kind of my way into it. But one of my early collections, which kind of you'll like this, that I kind of got into this stuff, Genesis, Pink Floyd. And I was obviously getting my friends into the music as well. And a few of them went with me. And then a couple of them who had older sisters, it was like, oh no, I've been told that's bad. I've been told it's very, very bad. And then one of the older sisters, I was there, and she just said, you like this shit, don't you? Here. And she'd apparently obviously been into progressive when it was fashionable. And she gave me 50 LPs. And I'm about
This is
13.
why you can do the album years.
I thought, what? She goes, just take it away. Take it away. And it was, and so this was the first time I'd heard ELP. Yes.
It's like, you know,
So
like all the military experts for a few years back, they'd gone around all the things, collecting all this Nazi memorabilia, and then suddenly it's like, oh, I don't think I
it's
should
like,
really
just
have this.
take this away.
Oh,
Just
give
get
it
it
to
out of
Tim
the house.
Bonus. He's into this stuff.
And of course, I discovered many of my favorite albums from this
What was in
stash.
there? Well, I love this. What was in there?
There was a lot. Well, the ones I remember the most were ELP and Yes, because I think she'd really gone against those. And then I do remember as well, a couple of days later, I was playing Seconds Out in the house of another friend, and the elder sister. Of course, in both cases, I fancied the elder sisters. You know, it's always
Yeah.
that case of, well, you're kind of looking up to them, but was just going, what on earth? Genesis, bollocks, pretentious bollocks. And then pointed at her brother and said, you do not like this. And the thing is, she loved things I loved, because I loved Bowie and Roxy as well. So for me at the time, not knowing the music papers, I loved Bowie because I'd heard Life on Mars on the radio. So I bought Bowie albums, and somebody sold a cassette of Low on Saudi, I think it was Saudi Arabian cassette for 5p on the school notice board. And I thought, I'll have that. I like Life on Mars, I'll buy Low. So this was how I got into it, by buying cheap things everywhere and anywhere. And so for me, I kind of had no prejudice, whether it was Bowie, Roxy, Stevie Wonder, ELP. It was all really interesting music. And I was discovering the parameters of my taste through it. But it was hilarious where there would be these occasional pushbacks, especially with older sisters.
Older sisters. Older late 70s sisters
Yeah,
enthralled in the burgeoning new wave scene in the UK.
exactly, because I, like you, was an only child.
I'm not an
And
only child. I got my brother.
oh, you got your brother. Well, I
Yeah.
like you, an only
He
child.
hated it. He hated all the music. I mean, but I liked what he liked because he liked Madness and Selector and the specials and all that. You know, he
I
was into
love
all
that
that.
stuff as well. You
Yeah,
know,
and I
Ghost
loved
Town,
all
one of the
that.
great singles of all time, you know.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I know exactly what you're saying. I think I've always been, as you know, I'm quite a natural contrarian. I like to take the other side, and often once I've put my contrarian point of view in, I usually flip and take everything in. And I think in the early 80s, when everybody was into ABC and Haircut 100, I
Mm.
was just naturally pushing against that with Hawkwind and Yes and Genesis, and I just wanted to go deeper and deeper into that. And remember having a very strong feeling that although everybody in my school didn't like this music and they kept telling me how awful it was, I thought it was because they were thick.
Yeah.
At 13, 14, that seemed the obvious. I was like, well, they're just thick.
Well, certainly I cleared houses. I remember at school, 'cause at school, for me, the most popular bands probably were, on one level, it's kind of Bowie, Roxy. On another level, it's heavy metal. People forget heavy metal and new wave of British heavy metal.
Well, that was my thing.
So Iron Maiden,
Yeah.
the
But they were
yeah,
still
Motorhead.
contrarian.
And I like,
That
yeah.
was still I can
And as you
remember that,
said,
you know, they won't go down the new wave of British heavy metal. That's me. I was 12 in 1980. You know, I got Axe Attack, I got Axe Attack 2, I got Metal for Mothers, I got Metal Mothers 2. Every Friday I listened to Tommy Vance's Friday Rock Show, and I bought Kerrang every week. That was me in 1980, 81. You know, I think I bought the second issue of Kerrang when it came out. And then you walked into our school, which had probably 1,000 kids in, and there was like 5 of us. You
right.
know, and if there was a school disco, you know, you'd go up to them and say, you know, can you turn off the Dexys Midnight Runners, please, and play us some metal? And after about an hour of cajoling, they'd play Status Quo for us.
We had
That's what I
a
remember of
few,
the early 80s.
we had a few people who liked Pink Floyd, Roy Harper, and so on. I do remember at the school disco, I tried to get Leonard Cohen's Suzanne and Van de Graaff Generator's Porn Hearts played, and the DJ, they had to listen to it in their head, and they were like, no. It was like, no, not at all. So it wasn't popular. There were a few kids who liked sort of Pink Floyd, Tyrannosaurus Rex, Roy Harper. So we had a few. But yeah, as at your school, certainly new wave, post-punk, which again I love because I was a huge fan of things like Japan and early Ultravox. All of those artists meant as much to me. I guess I was kind of eagerly devouring what I thought was interesting music. And it was only when I started reading the music papers in early 1980s that I realized how despised a lot of this was. And Melody Maker, you'll forget this, but Melody Maker at one point, 80, 81, they were still having best bands. Yes, Led Zeppelin, Genesis. And they actually said, we're going to discount all votes for these bands in the next poll. So there was a kind of a cull of it. And I loved Associates in Japan as much as I loved Pink Floyd, but I thought it was really unfair. So for me, rather than being a contrarian, I've always had that sense of fairness. It's like, actually, this is just as interesting. This is just as good.
Well, so I think that's where it's
very
similar to me, and the feelings you're describing. It's exactly the same sort of thing in that I heard the Yes album, and I can remember putting it on, and I was astonished. I'd liked music up until that point, but I was astonished by this, and it just kept hitting me with all this incredible stuff. And at that point, I went, "Well, let's go and see what everyone says," because I've discovered a masterpiece. So surely, and I was really into art, so I was always reading art books and reading critiques of Rembrandt, or and all that type of stuff. And the idea that Bach and Beethoven were brilliant. I thought, well, I've discovered the same thing in rock music, and so you'd go out and you'd buy like a Sounds or Melody Maker, or I used to get a lot of rock and roll encyclopedias that were coming out, and these critics seemed to hold it in utter disgust. And I used to refer to a lot of the Rolling Stone encyclopedias that would give scores to different albums, and when you got to Yes, they would give the full score to Close to the Edge. And then you get 3 stars for like Fragile, and you get 3 stars for maybe the Yes album. But then as soon as you got to going for the one, it was all like 1 star, or just they grudgingly liked the classics. But anything else, if it hadn't come through that, I used to think about that a lot, and I thought, what is it that they don't like? And I thought that they think it's self-indulgent. They think they're not going for the song. They're not playing for the song. But overwhelmingly to me, what it was these people were too competent, which meant it wasn't authentic. So I started to notice things like Prince. Prince can do a guitar solo for as long as he likes. Yeah. And no critic will ever. He's still brilliant.
Stevie Wonder, but what went against that is that people like Stevie Wonder were brilliant musicians with brilliant session musicians. There was competence to a degree, but I agree with you. For me, the great Yes albums are Close to the Edge and Going for the One. Those two.
Those are the two, yeah.
Always confused me the critical response, and I think it's purely a fashion thing. I think people were afraid to say this because when we first got signed, and we were signed in the early 90s as No Man, I remember doing an interview with The Wire, and I was talking about recording techniques, and I was talking about Tio Makera's work on Bitches Brew, the way in which he edited pieces together to create these phenomenal lengthy improvs and give them focus. And I said, oh, Eddie Offord used a similar technique with Close to the Edge. And the guy visibly turned cold at the mention of this. And for me, they are worth talking about in the same breath. They're both innovative, brilliant works. And it reminds me of a friend of mine who used to have tastes that were incredibly right on whenever it was right on. And so we'd walk around HMV, and I used to deliberately do things like put Meatloaf CDs in with his Fela Kuti collection. And then he'd get to the counter, and it would be the look of horror on his face as he'd have Focus or Meatloaf. And I guess I've never understood that. How can you be so upset by something like that? Because again,
I'm going to offer a take on it and see what you think. I think that rock music is different to rock and roll, and it's different to sort of British beat groups, and it's different to James Brown and all that stuff. In that rock music was sort of created in the UK in London in the 1960s, and it came out of the sort of British blues boom. And one of the innovations that the British did is they actually added long solos to the blues, which I don't think happened before. I know T-Bone Walker did some solos, but I've got a few academics that I've discussed this with on the channel, and I think they're right in that this idea that Cream came out with, which was that it's not just the blues, it's also pulling into a sort of the American tradition of almost like free jazz. It's that, you know, you've got these long, great big guitar solos that aren't like bebop solos. And I think towards the mid to late 60s, certain bands started to realize that this was ridiculous for British people to be standing on stage doing these long form solos, doing blues solos, and singing about the levees breaking and all that type of stuff. And I
Mm.
think, and this really comes from the Beatles, a lot of bands start to think, well, how do we integrate the English aesthetic into rock music? And I think progressive rock is the outcome of that. And it's something that people don't really think about, is
Mm.
how each band integrated this sort of American blues stroke jazz stroke rhythm and blues, you know, hard bop, all these things that are in the beginning of rock music. How do you integrate that with British cultural forms? Now, the Kinks did this, Small
Mhm.
Faces did this, the Beatles did. It wasn't the progressive rock guys. But I've just done a ranking of Jethro Tull's album, and it's fascinating to hear that first album where they are
Mm.
pretty much a British blues band,
Yeah, yeah.
but Ian Anderson is pushing against it, you know, and Mick Abrams just he wants to be a blues artist like Peter Green, but Ian Anderson's got this idea, and once he develops it, even though it's so strange and quirky, it then goes on to sell millions and to transfer across into the States. And there's so many of these bands. I think ELP do it, but in a completely different way. And I think Chaz and Dave do it. Believe it
Mm.
or not, I'm actually a big fan of Chaz and Dave. It's
Yeah.
basically, you know, Jerry Lee Lewis, and
Mhm.
everyone thinks that Cockney music is Jerry Lee Lewis, but it's not. Jerry Lee Lewis is American music. It put Cockney accent to it, and that's gone
Yeah.
all the way through. Ian Jury did it in a different way. Blur Park Life has done it in a different way. Streets have done it in a different way, and that like Sex Pistols, it's a certain British thing of going, how do we play rock and roll when we're British? David Bowie
Mm.
did it, you know, that, and it's all everybody did it in a different way. And I think that is often the aspect. It's those English tropes when, especially when it gets very literate, you know, the ones like Genesis who have gone to, you know, a public school and they've been taught about
Mhm.
lots on, you know, Greek mythology and English literature, and they can actually bring that into their music. The critics don't like that. That's what they don't like about early Genesis, is that.
Mm.
So it is all about posh boys, and it is all about maybe being a bit too educated and, you know, a bit too much versed in Oscar Peterson or Roland Kirk, and being able to trot those
But
things out.
then some of these, you know, if you're talking about people like, you know, certainly Bowie, Ferry, this is on the art rock side, and David Sylvian came from relatively ordinary working class backgrounds and transcended them. So you do have people who were equally experimental, pretentious,
Mm.
and kind of got away with it with the critics. And some of the, you know, I think that a lot of the early progressive rockers actually were from relatively ordinary working class
And I
backgrounds.
think the critics are reacting to that perception of that. You know, I recently went to see John Lydon do one of his talks, and it was really fascinating because he lived in such poor circumstances, and some of the
Mm.
stories he told were absolutely unbelievable. And yet he had that sort of English eccentric progressive rock mind, like you're saying, like us,
Mm.
and he's pulling all these different influences, you know, and somewhere being a big fan of like Sweet and you know, Mud and all those sorts of bands, that they fashioned the Sex Pistols out of that. And he was quite offish about the Ramones and Patti Smith and the Stooges and, you know, New York Dolls as being
Mm.
the precursors. He was going, well, no, it was Slade, and it was like, you know, it was us trying to do
Yeah,
that, you know.
which I
And
can see.
I think if you look into those types of bands, or you look into Bowie, they're all pulling on this central idea, which is this idea of Englishness and personifying that in American rhythm and blues or rock and roll or whatever you want to call it. And it's very interesting how they do it. And I think the critics that I actually think they get mistaken. They don't see the worth.
Mm.
I've just ranked Jethro Tull's albums, and the video's coming out nowish. I think it's going to come out today. And going through the catalogue, you can see the critics love them in the 1960s. They get then to this critical peak with Benefit and Stand Up, and the critics love those albums. Then they bring out Aqualung and sell like 7 million albums, become a stadium level rock band. Then they do Thick as a Brick, which no other band has ever gone that far out. It's unbelievable. And then at that point, the critics turn on them. And so
Yeah.
Passion Play, Minstrel in the Gallery, War Child, all those albums, when I was a kid, I never got them. I never listened to Minstrel in the Gallery because the critics had said how bad it was. And it's only now I've actually sat down and listened to them all the way through. And I'm listening to Minstrel in the Gallery. I'm like, my God, this is unbelievable. Almost like those albums aren't on the radar as progressive rock classics.
It's funny. I mean, I'm kind of lucky that I was given as an older brother this time, a load of magazines. I think it's called Music Scene, and it was an Enemy offshoot magazine from about 72 to 74. So it's got the reviews of these things at the time. And it's sort of interesting to see that, you're right. One of the bizarre things is that, yes, Ian MacDonald, the guy who writes the amazing book on the Beatles, close to the edge, a masterpiece rating in NME. So at this stage, they're still, and you can understand why. But there is some cynicism. Even at that point, there are always stages like you could see this in '68 when the Beatles do the White Album and the Stones do Beggar's Banquet, that there's a reaction against psychedelia, that psychedelia has gone too far from the roots of rock and roll.
That's my point. That's and the thing is that my counter argument to that, and I'm glad you put it to like that because I was waffling on trying to explain my point. My counter argument to that is surely from an authentic point of view, or the valuing of the Dionysian, the visceral more, a British person has to find a way of reflecting their culture, and actually the pretentiousness is to do a Led Zeppelin or a Cream and stand up there playing, Born Under a Bad Sign or whatever it is.
I think Led Zeppelin totally personalized it. I think Jethro Tull did. Pink Floyd, you listen to Wish You Were Here, that was dismissed at the time critically. And that is essentially a beautiful posh blues, Shining You Crazy Diamond, and I mean that as a compliment.
No, it's the same area as Albatross is in. Albatross by Fleetwood Mac, which you never perceive as a blues, but is completely, totally a blues, and there's nothing in it that does not make it a blues, except for the English aesthetic, and which is the poetry of deciding to try and illustrate an albatross, which you see, don't you? You feel the albatross. And I was astonished listening to that once. I went, hang on, it's a blues chord progression, it's a blues guitar solo, and all it is that Mick Fleetwood's playing it with mallets. And another interesting fact, Bev had told me this. Albatross went to #1, and then I think they went to #1. The Move went to #1 with, what would it have been? What was the Move's first single that went to #1? Whichever one that was, it wasn't Flowers in the Rain. It was whichever one that was. I would have thought.
Engine? What about the Fire Engine?
Not that one. It's the other one. Something Way.
Oh, Mulberry Way or something.
Something like that. Anyway, Bev performed that with mallets.
Okay.
So they had there's 2 records. That's a bit of trivia for you. You can look that up and get that right. So when your album years does something like 1968, you'll be able to trot that one out.
From the mallets. But I think so periodically, I think music went psychedelic. Then there were a few bands, the band were part of this as well, where it's almost bringing music back to the roots. And then the underground flourished. But at the same time as this, you've always got, I think the thing is, you've always got action and reaction in pop music history. So in the early 70s, when the progressive underground bands are at their most florid and brilliant, you've got the Sweet and Slade in the charts. You've got T-Rex bringing music back to Eddie Cochran basics. In 77, when punk supposedly destroys everything, in 77, 78, You've got War of the Worlds at #1. You've got Andrew Lloyd Webber's Variations. You've got Renaissance and Lindisfarne having the biggest chart hits of their career in '78, when supposedly this stuff is in the garbage
And
can.
also Going for the One, and even bad
Yeah,
albums like Love Beach would have been outselling the punk albums at that time, wouldn't they? Which was basically, a
completely.
minority of people that were in, to a certain little scene that was going on. Whereas, a band like Yes, We're Going for the One would have been selling internationally. And it was really interesting because I tell you what surprised me about Jethro Tull was just seeing the strength of their album releasing. They never brought a bad album out in the 70s. They just isn't a
Mm.
bad album, and it's so contrary to my gut feeling that I've got from the press. And when they get into that trilogy where they deal with the English aesthetic, when they go through like Songs for the Wood, and then they do Heavy Horses, and then they do Stormwatch, that's an incredible run. And Stormwatch in 1979 has taken on punking somewhat, but it's still a full-on progressive rock album, and it's a great success. The albums like that, I was surprised how great they were.
Yeah, well, again, I was lucky with those because they were always in the cutout bins. There was a shop in Manchester called Yanks, and it used to have US cutouts, and they'd be cheap. And so we could go at the weekend, get about 10 to 20 albums. And at that stage, for whatever reason, the Jethro Tull albums would be there. So would David Bowie's Stage,
Mm,
yellow vinyl, interestingly
yeah.
enough. But Stormwatch, then and now, I think is one of the great Jethro Tull albums. And I always say to people, if you want a sense of what it was like living in grimy Britain of the late 70s, early 80s, Stormwatch is as good, I think, as good as an example, as a description, because of course you have the North Sea crisis, the North Sea oil, and
Yeah,
so
yeah,
on.
yeah.
But it really does. I mean, Aqualung does it as well for the but Jethro Tull never shied away from politics, and it really captures that age in the same way
It
that
really,
Pink Floyd's Animals
those three
does,
albums,
whereas
like
The
Songs for the Wood.
Cure and The
See,
Stranglers.
yeah, I thought Songs for the Wood, which has always been my favourite. I love that album, but that's dealing with the esoteric English aspects. It's Willow the
Yeah,
Wisp and the Green Man, and then Heavy Horses is our sort of working class heritage. It's all about Britain's history and normal people having to work the land, and like you say, Stormwatch then captures in '79 that year that eventually brings Thatcher in, isn't it? And in that
yeah.
sort of darkness, which I remember sort of getting into music in that year, but outside it did seem very dark. And I think these aspects of progressive rock, they don't get valued at all. And it's not because anyone thinks like this now. It's the legacy of this music criticism that we all grew up in. All of us who are talking about it, because I'm very influenced by it as well. I have to try and fight against it. But the next question I've got for you is when we do the gig in Camden on what's the date of it again?
September 13th,
It's
Camden
September the
Club.
13th in Camden in
Yeah.
London
Friday,
town.
September 13th. Think of
Friday,
that.
and
Horror
the ticket
awaits.
link is down below. See how good I am, Tim. You see, right? So,
You're
but
brilliant.
when we go and do that gig, are we playing progressive rock? And if we are, what makes it progressive rock? Because it's your band and your songs. I'm just doing my job. But if it isn't progressive rock, why isn't it progressive rock? And why do you get tagged in the progressive rock realm? Which is, I think, is the best description of that category.
I honestly can't tell you, and I don't know what we produce. I mean, the point is, I've got a new album, Powder Dry, and there are 16 tracks, and I'd say there are probably 8 or 9 different
Mm.
directions, from art rock to electro pop to ambient to pure singer-songwriter, and it kind of reflects the range of my tastes. And I'm not sure. I mean, I think one of the things I can say about the band is that it allows playing. These songs are vehicles for the musicians as much as anything else. Although I kind of see what we do in the way of that late 60s. The sound is very different, but in the way in which in the late 60s, whether it's Lifetime, whether it's Pink Floyd, people exploring the possibilities of the song and song lengths being different,
Mm.
solo lengths being different, it being based on feel. So I think there's a lot of kind of jazz and underground rock influence from the late 60s, though the sound is very, very different. But yeah, in terms of it being tagged as progressive rock, it's difficult because it's not something I necessarily hear, though I've always been honest about loving progressive rock. I mean, when No Man will, I guess I'm one of the few people that have been on chill out compilations, indie compilations, and prog rock
Mm.
compilations. And when No Man were first signed, we were signed in the wake of Happy Mondays and Stone Roses as an indie dance band, and did what some people call as kind of a proto trip hop music using samples and so on. But we always drew musical influence from varied sources. So, on the debut No Man album, you can hear samples from Yes, Led Zeppelin, Pharoah Sanders, Miles Davis.
Mm.
We were never afraid to mention these things or use that. And I guess that because of that, and Stephen's subsequent work in Porcupine Tree, it's become lumped in with progressive rock. And I don't mind that, because for me, the progressive spirit is something that continually evolves. So I think in the early 80s, some of the most progressive music was by people like Associates, Japan, Ultra
Mm.
Rocks, blah, blah, blah. The electro pop artists were really pushing at the boundaries.
But that's very interesting because
Blue
I think,
Nile, Torchwood.
yeah, talk, and even Tears for Fears to some extent. I
Yeah.
think, yeah, I could see a parallel reality where the music critics weren't trying to promote themselves, where the story would be much more like it is in jazz. So you get the development of jazz, it turns into swing, and then the beboppers come along and they completely change everything, but it's still jazz. And then they carry on. Then
Yeah.
Ornette Coleman comes along and he changes absolutely everything, but it's still jazz. And my argument's been that punk was prog. It was all part of the lineage.
Post-punk was definitely
And then
prog, yeah.
but yeah, so the punk comes out and it's a little bit like Ornette Coleman. And then that freedom allows people to then take on the progressive rock sort of aesthetic, and everybody winds in a little bit. It's not like punk comes along and everything's like Nirvana after it. It's everything's, Joy Division to ABC to Duran Duran to all those bands that we grew up with in the pop scene that I was seeing as the opposite of what I liked, was, I think, are far more steeped in progressive rock than they are in punk. I think something
Yeah.
like Erasure is pretty much prog. All of these bands I can see of coming out of prog,
In a
and
way
that,
that they are. I'm gonna do two things. I think you're right. I think rock music used to be always about building from the roots and becoming more and more epic. So you could argue
yeah,
that out of blues, out of jazz, out of rock and roll, underground and progressive comes. Punk destroys that structure. And out of the same bricks, post-punk builds something
yeah.
different. But actually, a lot of the DNA is the same, but it's a different. And then
It's
I
just
think what you have
exactly.
to,
That's it. It's the same
yeah.
DNA. In that disco isn't. The real anathema to prog in 1976 and 77 was disco, and the only reason why War of the Worlds went to number one was because it was disco prog. That's Jeff Wayne's genius. Is
But
invented disco
lots
prog.
of disco is ambitious. You look at the Giorgio Moroder, Donna Summer stuff, there'd often be side-long suites. And I loved that stuff again at the time,
Yeah,
very cheap and Yanks.
and so
So it
this is
had
really.
progressive ambition.
So do you think what we're doing? There's a line that comes through. I would say it's David Bowie, Roxy Music, and then it's bands like Japan, and that end of popular music which never gets discussed. I think there's another line that comes up through to Bill Nelson, from Bebop. There's a certain line that's come straight out of prog, and I think that has really influenced modern prog. So, a band like Japan, if you mention Porcupine Tree, it's all over Porcupine Tree. I mean, they got one of the members of the band in, and
Yeah,
I,
yeah.
I think that's another thing that is not mentioned, is how incredibly prog bands like Japan were, you know.
Well, with that argument, this is one of the interesting things that, again, I was going to say in that kind of cycle, you could argue that dance music and hip hop in the late 80s grows and grows and becomes trip hop and drum and bass,
Yeah,
gets ever more. So I think we also have these cycles of building up, breaking down, building up again, similar DNA, but the different shapes emerge. So going back to the Japan Tears for Fears thing, obviously I've worked with a lot of those musicians, know quite a lot of those people.
yeah,
And the interesting thing is that I always heard a progressive rock influence in what they did, even though the music was quite different. And then when you discuss it with the musicians, you realize that they were totally aware of Brand X, Todd Rundgren, Genesis, King Crimson, and in fact, often were their biggest influences. Certainly in the Tears for Fears, like, Chris Hughes, the producer, is a massive progressive rock and jazz fusion fan. Zappa. He was the drummer in Adam and the Ants.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's a lovely guy who doesn't hide his enthusiasm, but he was always about trying to find what he wanted. I guess this is it. This is my relationship to prog. It comes back to something you said. When I first heard things like Wish You Were Here, Led Zeppelin's Kashmir, Tangerine Dream's Phaedra, yes, Close to the Edge, it was mind blowing. It was like, I've never heard music like this. It took me to fresh places. So, and the same is true when I listen to things like Portishead's debut or Associate Sulk. And what I want to do in my music is create something that takes me and the audience somewhere else. So there's a progressive DNA in whatever I do, in that it might be the first time I heard Close to the Edge and thought, where the hell has that music come from? And you want that thrill. So I don't want to repeat it. You know, I'm not interested in making The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway Part 2. I think it's a brilliant record, but I don't want to remake it. I'm not interested in remaking Tin Drum, you know, Tin Drum Part 2. So that's a thing. But yeah, it was curious that throughout the years, I remember once getting beaten up by a cousin because I'd said The Stranglers. This was like, I don't know, 81, and Golden Brown was in the charts, and it had a 5/4 time signature. And I said, oh God, you can really hear they've listened to progressive music. And his response was to punch me several times because he was a huge Stranglers fan. And of course, if you listen to No More Heroes and the lead bass, they're coming out of The Who, The Doors, Yes. And when No Man first got a record deal and we were in a major studio in the early 90s, we were there with the Stranglers. And we were talking about their influences. And of course, they loved things like Gentle Giant and the progressive rock bands. So I think this was one of the jokes that no one was allowed to say it, even though deeply some of them is their biggest influence might have been
Without a doubt, without a
Gentle
doubt.
Giant.
And you know, I felt such a
Um,
pang of happiness at that John Lydon when he started to go through all the bands that had influenced him and went through all the obvious ones and then moved on. And then right at the end, he goes, and Pink Floyd,
yeah,
because you knew it's like you know that that's the case. You know that
exactly.
nobody cannot be influenced by Pink Floyd of that age at that time. Everyone's heard the album, and nobody can walk around going, "There's nothing in that album that's any good. I'm going to ignore it all. It will never affect me ever."
It's a
Because
great
the anger of
guitarist.
Roger Waters' delivery and the sort of
Yeah,
intention, because this is one of the big things with British progressive rock. I think it pioneers, and it comes from Dylan, but it moves away from the love song, driving around in cars. You know, let's have a party and have a good time. There's a you know, rock music widens its palette of subject matter, and that sort of angriness that you get in punk, you can see is in Pink Floyd. You can see it's in Aqualung. You can sort of point back, and then the vocal
absolutely.
delivery is like Peter Hamill, obviously, who we obviously was a fan of your favourite.
Indeed. Well, but the interesting thing is, you listen to a lot of the great post-punk guitarists, and there were so many: John McGeoch, Keith Levine, Public Image. They were really stretching at the possibilities of music in the way that Howe and Fripp were. And you listened, Keith Levine apparently was the Steve Howe roadie.
That's right.
The
Yes,
Art of
yes,
Noise.
yeah.
Yeah, The Art of Noise. I think one of them was a Yes roadie. They were well aware of this music, loved this music. There's no way that John McGeoch hadn't been in love with Steve Howe and Robert Fripp at various points. And that's why he's so interesting, because he's applying those lessons to a different era and different technology. So yeah, that was one of the things that, you know, when we started working with a lot of these people, a lot of their heroes were the people who were strictly forbidden to discuss in the music papers in the early 80s. And yeah, it was a
I
very
keep
confusing time.
I keep thinking about Militaria. I'm thinking my brain's on the Hungerford massacre now. And how, you know, the police went out and my dad had to give up all his guns. You know, he had guns in the house. Some of them were disarmed, some of them were antique guns. He collected a couple of handguns and you had to all hand them over, didn't you? You had to go down the police station to go, sorry, I've got this and I've got that, you know, and I can remember that happening. And I think, you know, the legends of rock music, the ones who are still there, I think there should be a prog amnesty, and I think they need to come out and declare the bands that actually influence them, so we can clear out this idea that progressive rock
So
is this
I
anathema to
can't
human
mention this.
taste.
I can't mention this because of customer confidentiality, but we have quite a number of famous people who buy from Burning Shed. And a few of them are from the punk and the post-punk scene. And all I will say is that to a man, it's King Crimson, Van de Graaff, Generator, Gentle Giant, and one of them who is very famous. And this was a couple of years ago before, and we worked out that he was about to go on stage for a stadium gig, a huge stadium gig, punk hero, and he's ordering King Crimson box sets from Burning Shed.
Who's the
Oh, and Van
guitarist?
de Graaff
Who
Generator.
was the guitarist of Steve Jones of Sex Pistols? I was watching an interview with
Yeah.
him the other day, and they were talking about. He was going on about punk and what it meant and what it all did, and then he goes. They went to him. Do you listen to that stuff now? He went, "Oh no, no, no. I'm into Steely Dan now." And I thought that just
Yeah.
because you're going to be, aren't you? You know, everybody, any creative person wants new, don't they? And it's what you're going to go and grab and explore. And these things are touchstones. So I think we've put this to bed now. We've solved this now, Tim, with this video.
Uh-huh.
Not only have we been able to address the slight amount of tension between my YouTube and your tube, we have come together in an agreement. But we've also, I think, managed to really define the fact that we all love prog, and it's a great
Yeah.
form of
Well,
music, and we need to champion it, and all that
I
bit.
agree. But the one thing is that I agree with you as well. And you agreed with me, so I agree with you, which is that one of the things that prog wasn't hyped by, and I mean this with pop, glam wasn't, prog wasn't, soul wasn't, because I really love progressive soul of the late 60s, early 70s, Undisputed Truth, all of that stuff. Temptations when they were
Mm,
doing 10, 12-minute tracks.
mm.
The thing that they didn't have was any guidelines on taste. They just did what they wanted. And I do think that post-punk and that particular era of music journalism reined people into good taste. And I think sometimes
That is what I think, and I think ELP is a brilliant
restricted
example.
musical growth.
Yeah, ELP is a really good test case for that. Because I think because when I was pushing against it, I wasn't pushing against it. I was pushing against it because I agree deep down. I agree with you. You know,
Mm.
I'm much more comfortable saying well, Close to the Edge is a masterpiece, but I don't know if trilogy is. My gut feeling is like that. And yet, if someone was to say, well, what's more important, Close to the Edge or Blonde on Blonde by Bob Dylan? I go, well, it's the Bob Dylan album, which I can't
Right.
stand.
Okay.
Because I know that an erudite intellectual person who knows which buttons to push to show that they know what they're talking about should have Blonde on Blonde in their collection. I mean, I might do a top 10 of those, pretentious albums you have to have in your collection. Trap Mass Replica,
Yeah.
a few Dylan albums, probably Blonde on Blonde and Highway, whatever it is, Highway 51, is it? And you've got to have the Banana Velvet Underground, but you need to have the one before that as well. And then even the one before that with Velvet Underground. See, that's what I'm saying. I know it's passe to actually have the Banana Velvet
Yeah.
Underground album. You've got to
I
say you
think
like the one before. Astral
maybe
Weeks, of course.
I do. Well, I love Asteroids, and I love. But then, Common One is one you should listen to because that, to me, is one of the great Van Morrison albums, along with Astral Weeks and oh, the even
Well,
Fleas.
shall we do Astral Weeks the next time we've got a gig that
We
we need to
can
sell
do,
some
but the
tickets
point
for?
is, it's hated. It's hated because it came out in 1980. It's dismissed. It was dismissed at the time and by all Van Morrison critics as gibberish, as trash. It's exactly the same as everything else he's been doing, earlier. But because of the historical context of its coming out, it's the love beach of Van Morrison albums.
Oh,
And
that
I
sounds more
love
like
it.
my thing.
Yeah, and I like Love Beach as well. I think Love Beach, the second side, what a beautiful melody that is.
You're
You know,
totally right about Love
singing's
Beach.
amazing.
Totally right about Love Beach. And one of the things I was very pleased with the new John Anderson album, which I think is absolutely fantastic. I think it's a brilliant album. And I just love to hear John Anderson's voice. It's as simple as that. I've been listening to
Yeah.
it for 45 years. I love to hear his voice, like a proper prog singer singing prog. He defines it, and then the band delivers. They just do the job of doing yes type music. And
Yeah,
some
yeah.
of his vocal twists, I just love, right? The
Yeah, he's
cover is
honestly.
so awful. I'm worried. I'm worried that the cover is going to stop that album from being listened to. So I've proffered 4 covers,
Yeah.
and my favourite one that I don't know if you saw it, but it was because I thought Well, what did what does the word true mean? And I thought, if you're to do it yourself, true is when things are level, aren't they? So I've done one
Mhm.
with has got John Anderson with a spirit level, and he's checking this. He's checking. He's got the level correct, and he's putting his thumb up. And I think we need to, we need to get that album cover up instead of the one he's got.
I think, well, yeah, I do love, because one of the things we used to do with No Man, we love creating bad band names and bad titles. So, it's like with Theo Travis, who we both work with. And I always had this idea of Theo Travis's Theosophy, which is his jazz rock band, Theosophy.
Theosophy would be brilliant.
It's Theo by a fire. He's got a pipe, which is actually a saxophone. He's actually got saxophones that he can actually poke the fire with, alto saxophones.
Mm.
So terrible, terrible taste. But I do remember I had an
That
idea for
sounds
one
like a Herbie
called,
Mann cover.
does it?
Yeah, have you ever seen the Herbie Mann covers?
No.
I will
Well, I
send you some links. He's just a genius of that type of thing. So he will do an
really.
album called like Superman, and he's coming out of a phone box and ripping his shirt open, but none of it's quite right because they didn't have the budget to have a proper Superman outfit. And of course, he's got his goatee beard and his flute. But
Yeah,
there's
but
one
the goatee
album that
beard has got to be in the shape of a saxophone for that cover to
like,
work, I think. I mean, I always love Les McCann. Les is more. And I always had it in my head that Freddie
I've
had
gone dizzy.
a
That's made
come
me go
on,
dizzy
he's
there.
got an album hubcap, but he hadn't. Yeah.
Well, I've got a thing. I said the other day, I said any band that resorts to a pun in their album title, it's done for. And then they started to go, well, what about the Beatles? That's a pun. And I went, oh yeah. And then they
It's a
started to come
terrible
out. There's
one,
quite,
yeah.
it's quite interesting. We've got so much to talk about, Tim. We now what we do. We're just laying the groundwork for future videos. You need to pop up a little bit more, I think. Usually about 4 weeks before we've got a gig. I think if we can
All
organise
right.
that, stick it in the diary, that would help.
So look, we do a new podcast together talking about music is the new music.
Mm.
And we could actually talk about the industry as well. We could be like the rough-edged British Rick Beatos.
Well, we could be the rough-edged album years.
We could.
You can see what I'm
This
saying?
could be like album years fused with On the Buses.
Yes. Or are you being served? And with that, and the great circle, Gestalt Circle, has now joined it up. I think we're at the end because we started with them. Look at them behind me. We've ended with them. I enjoyed that very much. Anybody who wonders what it's like backstage at a Tim Bowness gig, it's basically me and Tim and the rest of the band chatting like this. And it's all we've done is capture one of our normal conversations, really, which is a very intense discussion of different music we like or dislike, peppered with odd sort of arbitrary Monty Python-esque references to other aspects of culture. And I think that's something we need to perfect. And if we can get that right and bottle it, we'll be on to a winner, Tim. You think?
I agree.
And the 10 greatest early 70s sitcoms then?
Oh, what,
Uh,
you want me to say this now?
Well, what's your favourite one? Just a day. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to, you don't have to
No,
refer to it.
I know what they are. I'd go for you. Probably won't agree with me on this. As a kid, I loved Steptoe and Son, Whatever Happened to the Likely Lads, and then I was also really attracted to the American series like Rhoda and Taxi.
I was a massive Rhoda fan. It was on about 9 o'clock on BBC Two. It's
Yeah.
and when my granddad died, we had his black and white TV, which was one of the advantages of him dying. A lot of it wasn't, but that was one. And my mum, so we had a television in our bedroom, and on a Tuesday night, I think it was, we were allowed to go to bed and watch half an hour of black and white Rhoda. If I saw it in colour, it would freak me out.
We had black and white as well. I have no idea why. This is obviously a story for another podcast, but
Yes, we got two. We're just talking like we're backstage now. You look like you're in a dressing room, and I just feel that we're about to go on stage in a minute.
this is my aborted studio. This was going to be my recording studio, but the acoustics were appalling.
They are appalling.
And then I bought an IsoVox 2, and it felt too much like being in the rat cage in Orwell's
Yeah.
1984.
And what's
So
that strange thing? But everyone's thinking it. They're not. I mean, they've got bored with us, but the thing that's keeping them there is that bizarre thing you've got on the wall, which I've been trying to think what you dangle off those. Whether you've got like ballet dance shoe collection, I mean, what would you need that for? What is it? Am I?
Human heads.
It's what?
Human heads.
Human heads.
Yeah.
Whose?
Come round, find out.
I will do. Let's save that up. So yeah, there's a whole. I need to finish now. Anyway, so there's a link down below, Prog fans, especially Prog fans around the London area. There's a link down below to our gig. Please come along. The irreverent humour that you are seeing here, you will get bucket loads of that from Tim. A lot of people don't realise that unless they've come to see us. That Tim is very funny on the gigs, which I'm just saying, I think that's one of the selling points for this. If you don't like the music, you might have a few little laughs throughout. But click the link, buy the tickets. Once you've bought the ticket, say you've bought it in the comments so we can see whether this has worked or not. Just say, I'm going to buy a ticket. And then if nobody does, well, I won't bother doing this again. And you can, what else could I do? Like the video. The album years, go over and subscribe. That's in the link below, as is a link to Tim's new album. There's so many links. Get your hand in your pockets. Stop being a skinflint and go and buy some stuff and support us artists in what we're trying to do, which is basically making the world a more beautiful place. You bloody, what's the word?
So I can afford something to actually hang on that piece.
Yes, yeah. I mean, look. Anyway, subscribe to my channel. And if you want to come and support me over on Patreon, you can. And one of the days, Tim, would you like to pop into my Patreon and have a chat to the patrons about?
I'll do that.
Yeah. So I've got him on camera now, so he's got to do that. It might be the next 4 or 5 years, but he will do that. So if you pop over because you want to have your own little conversation with Tim in a little group of about, say, 15, and we can have a nice chat about some of the stuff that we've been talking about. You could go and become a patron. But if you're a busy person and you don't want to waste your life on such trivialities, I have a PayPal tip jar, and you can stick some cash in that as well. And Tim, that's how you do it. Album years, come on, get all the money coming in, rake it in.
We're too polite to do that.
I know, I can't believe it. Have you got a PayPal tip jar?
No.
I bet Steve doesn't want to have one, doesn't he? Because I bet he'll think it's a bit crass if he's got one. So they all know I'm quite poor. Look, but at some point I won't be poor, but I'm still going to put on the idea that I'm poor because I want some of that money in the PayPal tip jar.
It's vulgar to talk about money.
I know. This is what I love about English people, But I haven't talked about it. I've just told them where they can go and stick it. It's down below. Down below. Share your wealth. The poor ones out there, you don't have to do it. In fact, if you're poor, put a message in. Tim will write your address down, and when you turn up in Camden, you can come in for free. How about that, Tim? That bit wasn't true. We can have a few in like that. If somebody really came to us and said, "Oh, I'm really having a bad. My wife's left me. I got no money, and I'm having to sleep with my mates. So I really want to come and see the gig." Would you let them in for free? If they managed to get a message through, would you do that?
It's well, look, I have been, oddly enough, I mean, this is probably for another podcast, but I have been asked occasionally to see people in hospital, fans of
really
and so on. Yeah, which I have done. And
well, that's a depressing note. Were they terminal, or were they just ill?
Yeah.
They were terminal, weren't they? Because you're not going to do that. No one's going to be lying in bed just having an appendicitis.
Look, if there's a broken collarbone, I'm probably not going to go.
Yeah.
To Watford General, but yeah, and it's very humbling because I mean I worked, before I got signed on my record and publishing deals, I worked with the NHS and I worked in this home for the elderly, mentally and physically infirm, which meant this was the old people's home that took in all the people the other old people's homes rejected because they were either too
and then so what happened then? So you once you finished that job, you thought, how can I take these skills and use them somewhere elsewhere? Oh, the world of progressive rock. So all you extremely old, mentally unstable prog fans, we'll see you in Camden. I mean, they like me insulting them. You see, you haven't realised this on the album. You're too polite. They like to know who's boss. They do, I tell you.
Yeah.
They like to know who's boss. We're here, they're there. They haven't got a podcast. They're not up here, delivering their, pearls of wisdom. They haven't worked in the industry. They've got no real understanding of anything.
Experience. You are a wonderful drummer.
Thank you very
That's
much.
one of the best drummers. I've worked with quite a number of brilliant drummers, and you're definitely in the top 10. No, but no, you are one of the best drummers.
Well, thank you very much.
And no, because we said this before, talking about the music is the new music, and to an extent, I think you do a really good YouTube channel. But I think it's sad in some ways that you're not out there playing because you're such an expressive drummer. I think what I like about you is you're technically very gifted, but you have a really good feel.
That's the jazz, you see. I think it's,
Yeah.
you know, when you're playing jazz, you're always hunting for that space. But I believe that there is something going on at the moment, and I think the nature of music is about to shift.
Hmm.
I've just taken on a new premises where I can do gigs of any size, from 1,000 seater right down to maybe 30 or 40 people, in beautiful
Hmm.
environments with rivers, and we're going to have cinema. Oh, and I want to try and do things differently. I mean, we did it a little bit with our gig we did down at Lode Street that we recorded, and that was a
Yeah.
very interesting thing to do, and that was a very enjoyable thing to be able to play that close to the fans or audience. I thought that was a really interesting thing because they felt much more a part of it, didn't they? And
Yeah.
so I think I really want to try and get these YouTubes and all the stuff we're doing to be able to get those to homogeneously work with the creative stuff. So, you know, I think it would be lovely at some point once I'm in the new premises for, you know, Butterfly Mind, our band, that's what they're called, everybody, you know, to come down to my new premises and do sort of an improvisational thing or even like a righty thing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
open up the process and discuss what it's like being in a band, or maybe just one of the rehearsals when you're sort of directing us on the arrangements. Because I've got to say, Tim, I've played in hundreds of progressive rock bands, and it's basically a recipe. You've got a list of things you've got to do, and that's what you're rehearsing. With Tim, it's not like that. He's not just open to improvisation, he's also open to things actually changing their aesthetic heart, which I think is really interesting. It's not just improvisation. I mean, we did one gig where we did one song, and then we did it at the end again. Remember, because we'd run out of songs, and I decided to just do it completely different, and it was much
Yeah.
funkier.
Yeah.
And I've never had that sort of freedom in a band.
And we
It's
all
so
responded to it. It
yeah,
was like some vicious punk funk piece that
but yeah,
everyone locked into.
locked. Yeah, so
Oh,
if that's
yeah.
what you're going to see at the gig, and I'm not just saying this. I know I've been being a bit facetious and cracking a few jokes and trying to expose the sort of you know, this commercial idea of trying to sell the tickets for you. But please come, because even if you've heard the albums, you've heard anything, you'll be in for a night of whatever happens that night. We don't know, do we?
We
Shall we?
don't.
Shall we say bye, Tim?
Bye bye.
I like to do it in a more sort of BBC children's TV. So I just got to get my hand on the stop, and then we go bye bye everybody. You got to do it as well, Tim. Bye bye
Okay.
everybody. Bye
Bye bye.
bye. Bye bye.